A video on making gluten-free bread. So I was given some gluten-free flour by someone, and I was kind of thinking, I'll have to do something with it. So let's have a go at gluten-free bread. Now that's my sourdough. This is my sourdough starter, and so that's got gluten in it. This flour hasn't. So I was kind of thinking, will the sourdough starter work in gluten-free flour? Like, what does the actual yeast of the sourdough starter eat? Is it gluten that it eats, or is it just carbohydrates and sugar? Well, similar type of things, but is that what the sourdough starter eats? So I don't really want to add the starter to it because that's got gluten in it, so I want it to be a completely gluten-free flour. So what happens sometimes is the starter splits a little bit of water out of it. So let's add that water, which will hopefully have a tiny amount of gluten in it, but it will also have some of the yeast that ferments the bread. So we've mixed that little bit of water into there, and then we'll see if that turns into a sourdough starter. If it starts to bubble, we'll know that the starter's kind of going. And my theory with that is that we're going to use a sourdough starter rather than just fast-acting yeast, because obviously a fast-acting yeast, if we could have a loaf of bread made in a few hours. But I've been faffing around with not kneading breads and different kind of methods of making bread, and if you don't knead the bread and use sourdough starter, the sourdough starts to activate the gluten in the bread. Yeah, the sourdough starter. So it doesn't particularly, no knead bread doesn't particularly work very well with fast-acting yeast, dried bread with yeast, but it does work with a sourdough starter. So because there's not any gluten in this flour, I just kind of thought, well, let's do it that way around and see if a slow fermentation of gluten-free flour makes a difference. And if it doesn't, we can always have a go with that fast-acting yeast. But I was just curious. So we'll leave that for 12 hours. We'll see if it starts to bubble, and then we'll make some bread out of it. If it doesn't start to bubble, feels a bit grainy. If it doesn't start to bubble, we can always add a bit of sourdough starter. And if the sourdough starter doesn't want to start fermenting in it, like there might not be enough of that of the yeast in the bit of water that I poured into it, we'll add some sourdough starter and use it as a bit of a starter base. And if that doesn't work, then we'll use some fast-acting yeast. But we'll just kind of see, just a bit of a play around, see if it kind of works. Right, 24 hours. Let's move the camera. Well, 24 hours-ish. 18 hours. And nothing much has happened there, even though it's been out all day. So it doesn't look like we're getting any fermentation. And that, I don't know if there's too much flour and water in there for the amount of the water from the sourdough starter that's in. So let's add a bit of sourdough starter. So when did I feed that? I fed it last night. So let's put a decent sized glob in of sourdough starter. I didn't really want to do this because then it will mean that this flour is now gluten. It's got some gluten in it, which is not what I wanted. It's not what I wanted. But I'm just curious to see if it will ferment. So we'll leave that 12 hours. It's all mixed in. We'll see if it wants to start fermenting and turn it into a sourdough starter, a gluten-free sourdough starter. There we go. 12 hours later, and that started to ferment, start to rise, and then it's gone flat, like that. So I think that the only reason that it rose and started to ferment was the yeast was using up the bread flour that I added to it. I don't think it wants to eat whatever the gluten-free flour is made out of. What is it made out of? What is it made out of? Dun, 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 dun. Rice, tapioca, potato, gram, buckwheat, carob, sugar, beet fibre, thickener, xanthan gum. So, sourdough starter does not like to eat any of those things, so we can't ferment it. So, to be honest, I'm slightly glad, because I was looking at the ingredients, I was looking at the way that you make bread on this, and you have to, if you can read this, so to make an oven bread, a brown bread, you have to, you need egg whites, you need sugar, you need salt, you need oil, you need vinegar, you need milk, and some oil, and some yeast. So I'm kind of like, if you have to add all those ingredients to a gluten-free flour, then it's not really, it's more like a cake, isn't it, to be honest. So yeah, I'm kind of glad it doesn't work. Will I have a go at making brown bread now I've got that flour and add some egg whites to it? Maybe when I haven't got when I've got less to do. But that didn't work, so that's fine. That'll go in the bin. Not many things in my house do actually make it to the bin, and I'll get used to something else before they actually make it to the bin, but I'm not going to find a use for that. But there we go. So, a failure because we can't do something, but that doesn't matter because we've learned something. We learned that we can't do it, which is a success.